And it just so happened that the very first cannabis store to open after legalization and the first store to have a social equity permit happened to be owned and operated by people who were close to then Mayor London Breed. They included not only Breed's former chief of staff when she was on the board of supervisors, but they also included a city hall fixture named Sean Richard.
What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
Greetings from America's weed mecca of Northern California, where it's been about 10 years since you could buy weed legally, no prescription, and yet thousands of people are still locked up for weed-related quote-unquote crime here in the States and in other places where it's become legal during that time. In San Francisco, one of the attempts to repair some of the harms of the war on drugs came in the form of a sort of DEI for the weed industry program. Chris Roberts is, of course, one of the Bay's best old school journalists. Chris just published a story at the Chronicle about the tragedy of the attempt to repair some of the harms of the war on drugs using the business of weed. The story has so many good angles, like the promising opening of a cannabis shop on Haight Street with a social justice mission. It has City Hall insiders like Conor Johnston, London Breed's old roommate and campaign manager, who is a white dude that made out really well off of this equity program. It includes one of San Francisco's most successful weed and also streetwear brands, Cookies, and it also addresses some bigger picture questions like how effective can capitalism be at repairing some of the ills of capitalism. And before Chris comes on, here's where I plug the Patreon, patreon.com/SadFrancisco. Please go there and sign up. You can even sign up for free. Stay on the list as some of these social media platforms are becoming less reliable as a way to outreach to people. And if you can, become a member there and help to pay for some of the production costs of the podcast. Again, it's patreon.com/SadFrancisco. Chris, thank you for coming back. And now we're going to be talking about like a bit of a different topic today. And as somebody who has covered the industry of cannabis for many years, we're getting like some good insight. Again, in my eyes, you are the top weed historian of the Bay.
Thank you.
If not the state. And so today you're going to kind of like give us some details about this story that ran in the Chronicle end of September. And it's looking back at an attempt to like make up for some of the ills of the war on drugs.
Yeah.
And like, so who is Big Cannabis?
Big Cannabis, I think, in a lot of ways, it can be just seen as capital, but it is also, in some places, the big public. I guess broadly speaking, it's whoever wants to take control of the cannabis industry, and that can vary from place to place. That's because we still have a patchwork of individual state markets because there's still federal cannabis prohibition, legally speaking anyway. And this is where things get a little bit complicated. A cannabis product, and we're going to differentiate that from a hemp THC product because that's the big, I think the big change, big innovation, you could say, over the past, say, 5, 6, 7 years has been the proliferation of hemp THC products all over the country, including sold by the mail. But anyway, so Big Canna was essentially the worry when state level adult use cannabis legalization was spreading around the country. People rightly looked around and noted that the legal market seemed to be dominated by a couple big companies, and the couple big companies were primarily run by people who were white and male, people who might be dressed kind of like me, wearing like a jacket, although I don't know if theirs was like secondhand. And that was true in the medical marijuana era. And so when adult use legalization was happening, there was a belief that there was going to be an immense amount of money available. And there was a desire to ensure that some of that money went not to white male people who might not have been involved in the growing and selling of cannabis while it was illegal and suffered some of the consequences, but that it would go to people who actually suffered during the drug war. And that, I think, was the ethos behind the social equity program, or behind the movement to ensure that marijuana legalization would have a social justice aspect. And San Francisco had one of these programs as well.
A couple of people who were among the first to take advantage of this program that SF was putting forth were Conor Johnston and Johnny Delaplane.
Right.
Could you introduce them to listeners?
Yeah, so the San Francisco got a kind of a late start on opening adult use cannabis retail, or at least opening up new stores. The existing medical marijuana, the stores that were existing in the medical marijuana era, they were allowed to go adult use, but there was a lot of intense interest in joining the industry. And it just so happened that the very first cannabis store to open after legalization, and the first store to have a social equity permit, happened to be owned and operated by people who were close to then Mayor London Breed. They included not only Breed's former chief of staff when she was on the board of supervisors, a city hall operator named Conor Johnston. They included an existing cannabis merchant. His name was Johnny Delaplane, sort of like a local business guy. Ran like a dog walking business in the Panhandle, not too far away from where their store opened in the Haight-Ashbury. But they also included a city hall fixture named Sean Richard. Sean really kind of like fit the profile of the kind of person that you might want to be benefiting from legal cannabis. I mean, he's a black guy. He's from the Western Addition, grew up in public housing, former offender, went to prison, he claims, for selling cocaine in San Mateo County, and, remade himself into a non-violence advocate after when his younger brother was shot and killed in a drug war shooting in the mid 1990s. And Sean, who ran for supervisor later, really known in city hall circles, I think, as the kind of voice for, as a major voice for like Black San Franciscans as well. And so, you have this sort of like dream team of city hall operators. You have the mayor's former chief of staff, who's also involved in some of her mayoral campaigns. You have this friend of the mayor, who's well respected in sort of like the nonprofit, advocacy world as well. And you have someone who's experienced with retail. So really, it was checking all the boxes.
Yeah, and they found a spot on Haight Street, which, I immediately associate Haight Street with like the smell of marijuana.
It says something about you, maybe, Toshio. I don't know.
So it's like, what could go wrong with
Right.
like a prime location like that? Three people who have a lot of connections and also have like, experience with dealing with the city. Could you talk about how like this permitting process initially, I mean, it was launched as seemingly like a sort of attempt to avoid corruption and bribery problems that arose in other states?
Yeah, and maybe just to introduce that concept a little bit. So in other states, and this is kind of like what earlier we're talking about, what is Big Canna? And Big Canna, again, is anyone that's able to take control of one of these markets. One way in which that's been achieved is by limiting the number of permits allowed, whether it's for retail, for dispensaries, whether it's for cultivation, commercial cannabis testing or whatever. If you're able to artificially limit the number of entrants into the market, you can then engage in the kind of like, rent-seeking behavior, rentier capitalism that we see in stuff like, I don't know, the housing crisis or any other any other kind of like, commodity market where there's an artificial limit on the entrance into the market. So San Francisco wanted to avoid some of the issues that we're seeing in other states. And these issues did include, literal passing of envelopes of cash to decision makers, be they mayors, be they people on, key commissions. Just pretty much old school like bribery happened in other states where the number of permits were either limited by like a lottery or by like a merit based system. You saw a lot of like, and even when there wasn't any corruption, there's lawsuits, there's like controversy. There's been some real messy situations. So San Francisco decided that they would avoid that. They're going to award permits not via lottery and not by a merit based system, but that they were going to just employ the sort of like first come, first serve process in instances where there was not de jure license caps, but sort of like zoning rules put a de facto, you could say, cap on the number of permits allowed in San Francisco. You can't put, for example, like you can't put a weed store too close to a school, too close to a playground, too close to another weed store. And so in places like the Haight-Ashbury, where there was a lot of people interested in being the first to open up a legal cannabis store. And the other thing we should add is that for whatever reason, well, there are reasons, but there was not a legal weed store in the Upper Haight, in the Haight-Ashbury, even in the medical cannabis era. There was a couple in like Lower Haight. There was a famous one, Vapor Room, that was open, since the first term of George W. Bush, had to close because of federal pressure under Obama. It's a whole different story. Anyway, so the Lower Haight had weed stores. The Upper Haight never had one. And so you can imagine if you're in the legal era and if you're told that the legal cannabis market is going to be billions of dollars and you have the opportunity to open up a place in the Haight-Ashbury, which, as you said, for a lot of people, synonymous with the counterculture, synonymous with stuff like, drug use. Yeah, you can imagine the intense interest. And so you had multiple people aware that there was going to be only one weed store in the Upper Haight. And so the idea was if you were the first person to get your application in, that you would have first crack at that market.
Right. And so like the first people to register an application came in 8 minutes after the application was released.
Right.
Exceptionally fast.
It was fast. Just so happened to be this dream team of City Hall insiders that we were just talking about.
Right. It's almost as if you could, think about like a situation where maybe they got all of the questions ahead of time and were able to, just quickly usher it into the form online. And there was no way that they were going to be anything but number one on the list.
And that was absolutely alleged, as a matter of fact. Yeah, as it came out. Yeah, that so it happened, or it was revealed that, yeah, Conor Johnston, the mayor, and a lot of this, I have to emphasize that there's not been any allegations of wrongdoing on this aspect of it in particular. But I think like optics wise, you kind of have to look at what it looks like. And what it looked like was that, this individual with City Hall connections was one of about 15 or 20 people, I think. And there are some other names on there that are familiar, like, Karim Mayfield, the boxer, hard hitter. He was on that list of beta testers for the application. But the other thing you got to remember is that the final application and the beta didn't match one another. But you can imagine how that looked to the parties. And there were at least two who didn't get to open up a cannabis dispensary in the Haight-Ashbury when they found out that the connected team, that this team here got their application in not an insane amount of time ahead of everyone else. It should be mentioned that I think like the next closest was only a few minutes behind, is like 12 or, maybe 12 or 15 minutes. So there were a bunch of parties that got theirs in pretty quickly, but in the Haight-Ashbury, they were by far the fastest. I think the second fastest came in about 35 minutes after the fact.
Right.
And
So
yeah,
you're pissed. You're pissed if you didn't make it in within
yeah,
like the first hour, and you see people who have these close connections to the mayor um, making it through.
right,
And I mean, a lot of the problems like were like in this story have to do with the permitting process. But beyond that, talking about like more generally about problems with capitalism and using
yeah,
it as like sort of a solve to heal some of the problems
that's right.
of the war on drugs. I think that for me is like one of the big takeaways. Um, so many issues seem to arise from financialization that you speak to in the story,
Yeah,
including that rush for permits. The idea that maybe you could sell the permits down the road was one of
yeah.
them.
Yeah, that became a big issue here. I mean, the other thing that we should mention is that this store that opened up in the Haight Ashbury, owned by Sean Richard, um, Conor Johnston, and Johnny Delaplane and their partners. It also had the best branding. They were also the first legal store to use the Cookies brand. Cookies is a San Francisco brand. It's probably the biggest brand in legal cannabis. So yet another element of where it appeared that it would be a very successful store, but then you could also kind of like you could also kind of ask, I mean, are the benefits going to go to drug war victims? I mean, of which Sean Richard definitely is. That being said, yeah, it was never explicitly stated, but it was never necessarily explicitly stated by the regulators or by the policymakers. But it seemed pretty clear pretty early on that the legal cannabis like social equity program, or the idea that permits would be reserved for drug war victims, was seen as a method of reparations, but without ever saying the word or without actually ever like doing reparations. Um, I think that it is, you don't have to go back very far to hear people talking about generational wealth, about how this would create generational wealth and how this would be like a make good for the generations now that we have of families, mostly people of color, that have been wrecked by the drug war. But even early on, I think you heard some pretty thoughtful critiques. I mean, I didn't get this bit in the story, but I remember someone asking me once, this guy actually had, it's from Hunter's Point. He actually had a social equity brand. And he said once, what if I don't want to sell weed? What if I don't want to be engaged in the same kind of activity that might have landed myself or one of my members of my family in jail? What if I want to go to college? What if I want a startup loan, open up a barbershop? What if I want to do literally anything? And that just wasn't on the table. I mean, the one offer was that if you could prove, and we should also say this wasn't the only qualification to get a social equity permit. It's sort of another story, but really, like, the message was, okay, if you did suffer in the drug war, we're sorry. Here's your opportunity to enter a highly regulated, highly taxed version of the former illegal market. By the way, and this wasn't what was mentioned, but this became clear pretty soon. Again, like we're saying, it's going to be extremely heavily taxed. It's going to be taxed like 35, like 40% out the door. And by the way, the price is going to be lower than it's ever been before because there's more product and more people selling it. So you're basically saying, yeah, the only make good is to enter this highly taxed, highly regulated, highly competitive field. And by the way, we're not going to offer you anything or very much in the way of startup capital. You're on your own to get the startup capital. So really, like, you have a lot of the same disadvantages that you'd have entering any other field. The only thing that's maybe good about it is, all right, you might have a slightly easier time getting a permit, but you're
Right.
still on the hook for you're still on the hook for getting capital to get rent, to get, build out on your building. And we should also mention that for a long time, and I think this is still true, anytime anyone found out that you were in the cannabis industry, you were charged some kind of premium. I mean, whether that was because landlords in these so-called green zones the only areas in the city where cannabis retail were allowed, that they knew that they had a scarce resource and they could charge that. I think it's a combination of that and also just this belief that, oh, legal weed, you're going to make lots of money, right? And so that was an opportunity for, ancillary, for providers of ancillary services like real estate, professional services, HVAC, you name it, to charge cannabis entrepreneurs a premium for that too.
Yeah. And like you said, yeah, I mean, the fact that the barriers to entry were so many,
Yeah.
people are going to companies that are already established, like cookies, that have this startup capital that are going to reap the benefits ultimately of what is, an equity program. Although in this case, cookies did not
No.
reap the benefits. They kind of fast forward, like this store that is kind of central to the story no longer exists today.
That's right.
Um, and how? Yeah, what happened with this cookie store?
Well, to fast forward all the way, I mean, there is a cannabis store there now, but kind of one of the many ironies is that it is one of these big dogs. It is like a national brand called Ease is now selling
Hmm.
cannabis there. But long story short, so this came out earlier this year in arbitration. So what you would see publicly is first the store in the Haight-Ashbury lost its cookies branding. That's the other thing, that it was not actually ever called cookies. It was called Burners on Haight, named for one of the founders of the brand, and probably like the most prominent individual, the most prominent figure in the brand. Local guy named Burner, went to Galileo High, huge on Instagram, stuff like this. So it was named for him because city regulators thought that a store called Cookies might attract kids,
Right,
despite
right,
the
right.
fact that there was a cookie store in Oakland, there was a cookie store in Hayward, there was one in Antioch, Sacramento, a couple in LA. And I think is part of the problem, is that as the cannabis market launched, there is unfortunately it was saturated. There wasn't much of a reason for people to drive into San Francisco to go to a weed store. I think that the same kind of feeling that you had, that I had too, that all right, Haight-Ashbury is synonymous with cannabis sales, partially a function of the 1960s hangover, but just the idea, it was true that was, you knew that you could drive into the city, you could go to Haight-Ashbury, and you could find some weed. But in the legal era, you could buy it in Tracy. There's a store in
Hmm.
Tracy. It's one of the biggest in California. There's a store everywhere. And then there's more people than ever before. You name it, on Facebook, wherever, you can find people to sell you weed. It's easier to buy pot now than it's ever been,
Right.
certainly in my lifetime. And so
Yeah,
the
Ease is
allure,
like mobile. Ease is
and that
started
too, yeah,
mobile.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. I mean, there's like so many people falling over each other to give you their cannabis business. Like they're going to deliver it to you. They're going to give you BOGOs. They're going to
Yeah.
on top of the fact that because of one of the good things of legalization, like criminal penalties are reduced. Even though like the FBI put out a report recently that the most common drug crime in America, the most thing you're going to most likely be arrested for drug wise, is still cannabis possession.
Mhm.
Yeah, so there's just a mess of this stuff. Anyway, but what you saw outwardly was first the store lost its cookies branding, and you never really knew why. And then shortly, a few months after that, the rebranded store closed. It turned out that there was an internal dispute over one line in the licensing deal between the city hall team and Cookies. And for whatever reason, Cookies agreed to a thing called a put option. And when exercised, it allowed the City Hall insiders to force a sale, to force Cookies to buy the store from them for the flat price of 10 million bucks. $10 million, irrespective of how much it was selling, how good it was doing,
Yeah.
or whatever.
It's huge.
Another
Huge
thing that
value.
you got to mention, though, is that at the time that was signed, you weren't allowed to sell your weed store at all. Or no, sorry, you were allowed to sell your weed store, but only after it being in operation for 10 years.
Right.
And that was something that was changed by Mayor London Breed about a year and a half before that put option was exercised.
Because that was like a I don't know, fail safe is the right word, but like something that was put into the legislation to make sure that this was like an equity program and that people weren't just buying
Yeah.
or buying in because they wanted the permit and then they wanted to sell it sell it away immediately.
Yeah, I think like the intent and this was something that was negotiated I believe in 2017, back before the market launch, back before, we had really had any live data as to how things were going to go. And I think, yeah, the intent was to cut down on speculation. The intent was maybe to prevent big operators from coming over and taking over the San Francisco, cannabis retail market. Because yes, we are a place that uh, values local brands, even though we have Blue Bottle that's now owned by Nestle and things like that. So, obviously we have an appetite. We don't differentiate too much, but yeah, like
Yeah.
the stated intent was to keep big canna or just capital, you could say, from coming in and taking over the legal cannabis landscape here in the city. But I think that like seeing it from the perspective of one of these social equity holders, if you wanted to like raise money by selling, and you could sell like part of your business, but if you wanted to raise a significant amount of capital by selling like a majority of your business, or if you wanted to like any number of things, or if you just wanted out, right? Like, if you wanted to run your business for just a couple years and then sell it, you couldn't. You were really anchored to it for 10 years, which is a long
Mm.
time. It's just the fact that not everyone who starts a business wants to be doing that for 10 years. And if there's a time when you feel like you're going to get a really good amount of money for your business, you want to sell it. So,
Sure.
again,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
some of the context that I think is necessary to realize that I couldn't find a single cannabis operator that liked this rule. They all wanted to be able to sell. They all wanted the flexibility to raise money or to get out or whatever. And earlier I was saying, I was mentioning how other equity operators that I've met have wondered, why is it that I must sell cannabis? Why is it that I must be in the cannabis industry? Why can't I do something else? That was one of the arguments used by one of the city hall connected people, Johnny Delaplane, when arguing for a change in the transferability rules, which they did get in the fall of 2021. And
Right.
so instead of 10 years, you could sell after 5 years. And so it just happened that, 5 years to the day after being the first in queue in the equity application, that was when the Johnston, Richard, and Delaplane team exercised the put option. And after almost 2 years of arbitration, a judge sided with them and told Cookies that yes, like you owe this team a little bit more than $8 million for an admittedly failed marijuana store, which we
Right.
should say this is in a time when you literally cannot give a cannabis retail permit away. I mean, a, a couple stores have closed. I mean, there's a store that closed in Divisadero. The Vapor Room closed in South of Market. I mean, this is a really bad time to be a cannabis retailer. There's just you cannot get an exit like that right now.
Yeah. They put like a more recent like cap on the number of like, well, the permit, there was always a cap on the permits, but like they lowered it more recently. Is that correct?
Well, there's a bunch of. I mean, again, like there's been a moratorium on new permits.
Mm.
There's a bunch of applicants even now still. So for the past 2 years, 2 years and about almost 6 months now, since the summer of 2023, there's been a moratorium on new permits in San Francisco. The argument being that the existing ones were struggling to saturate the market even more with more retailers would lead to more business failures. And there was dozens of people, I think, that have just walked away mid permit process. They sort of felt that, like, yeah, even though you've spent all this time and money trying to get through the process, trying to open up your store, that is really only throwing good money after bad to open up at this time. So yeah, I mean that's how
Mm.
bad the market is right now.
So as far as like lessons, I mean, the first equity weed store no longer exists in the
Right.
Heights. Um, and now, yeah, like I have to ask, like is something like this, like an equity small business program, a great way to address social inequality, do you
I
think?
don't I can't really think of an area in which the market has managed to right wrongs of social justice. I mean, we've seen the market try and solve the housing question. I mean, you always hear that, well, it's just because you just can't build enough type thing. But yeah,
Right.
in this instance, again, kind of like we're saying earlier, to tell uh, broadly speaking, a class of people that don't have the same access to capital, don't have the same access to opportunities, to tell them that the make good for generations of over policing and criminalization is just enter the market and try and compete with other well capitalized entities. Yeah, it didn't work. I mean, could it work? I don't know. I don't really see much in the way of evidence to convince me that it could. And yeah, I mean, I think that if policymakers are serious about righting some of the wrongs of the war on drugs, that there's going to be an effort to reevaluate not just the social equity program, but the idea that you could quote unquote right the wrongs of the drug war by this method at all.
Yeah, I mean that's why I think that these like post-mortem stories are so important. Just to give people who are making this kind of attempt at repairing past harms, like um, some history about like, oh, we
Yeah.
tried this.
Well, and the other thing too, it's that I don't want to we want to credit lawmakers for trying, and that's
Sure,
not to say that you
sure.
shouldn't try, and that's not to say that you shouldn't try again. But I definitely think that if you're serious about, well, it's a couple things. I mean, and maybe this has been said many times. I mean, people are sick of hearing it, but yeah, I mean, if you are in the legal cannabis space, at chances are you're struggling and you're paying a lot more in tax. You're being asked to do lots of things that, first of all, other businesses aren't being asked to do. I mean, other retailers aren't being asked to do, in terms of how much you have to pay in taxes, not to mention the unequal access to like banking services and investment that federal marijuana prohibition present. There's lots of restrictions that are specific to cannabis businesses, not just
Right.
retailers. So yeah, I mean I think that it is absolutely reasonable for a lot of these operators in the legal cannabis space to be. You hear them asking for tax relief and things like this. And this is right after hearing how many billions of dollars were going to be available in legal weed. But yeah, anyone trying to play by the rules in legal cannabis is really suffering and struggling because those rules are very difficult. And so yeah, those need to be reevaluated. I think like that's fair. And yeah, I mean, you do need to keep asking the question of who is going to benefit, especially if it is an area like selling weed, selling drugs that has traditionally been the realm of people for whatever reason shut out from more mainstream areas of business.
Yeah, yeah. Seems like it should be like more aligned with, I guess, at the very least, like businesses that serve alcohol. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one argument that you hear a lot, and that seems like difficult to. I mean, it seems hard to argue with that. I mean, one of the things that is interesting is that weed's a lot easier to make for some people. I mean, like growing weed is not easy, but some people are pretty good at it, and some people are pretty good at growing pretty good weed with not a lot in the way of resources, right? Like just a few lights, a closet, a spare room, like things like this. Like there were a lot of people, like in the medical cannabis era, you could walk into a dispensary and you'd see some pretty remarkable product. You wouldn't see a lot of it, but you'd see some because it was grown by someone with not a lot in the way of resources. And I guess like you might struggle to do the same, to make the same impact with the same level of resources if you're trying to make whiskey, if you're trying to make beer or wine. I think that, yeah, it's a very unique thing, cannabis. And while I think like something closer to the alcohol model would be more appropriate, I don't know if that necessarily fits either. It is kind of its
Perfect.
own thing,
Yeah.
you know?
Not a
Yeah.
perfect parallel necessarily.
But,
Um,
but better, I think, than what we have now.
And like in your reporting for this story and other stories, are there better ways that you've seen presented potentially that government and or industry could atone for the war on drugs?
I mean, I think that that's a really good question. That's a really hard one because you are kind of asking to put a dollar figure on. I mean, what does it cost to, let's just maybe think about a community that has been harmed by the war on drugs, which is not too hard to find, because obviously like the fentanyl crisis is alive and well with us. I mean, but how do you put a dollar figure on the opportunity lost because you had a parent go to prison for a nonviolent offense? How do you put a dollar amount on the idea that you lost your student loans, or you were denied employment, or you were denied educational opportunities because you had a nonviolent drug offense on your record? I mean, I don't know. I mean, you are kind
Right.
of, I think that's a tricky, I think that's a dangerous path to trod. And I think that really it also it unfortunately does go straight to questions of reparations. I think that in this country, it's not an accident that most that disproportionately the impact of the war on drugs has fallen on communities of color, specifically Black people. I think it's real hard to argue that that's not related to all the other slights that have followed the end of slavery in this country. And so you're kind of being asked, right, how do you atone for all of this? And I think that you really can't ever, but you can use the government to raise people up rather than immiserate them. And, I think that that's a benefit that everyone should
Yeah.
enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, with even people who are still in prison as a result of cannabis related quote unquote crimes, like, have you like seen, proposals to like fund the getting of those people out of prison and allowing them to re-enter society?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of, and I think to their credit, there are a lot of lawmakers who recognize the need for there to be a restorative justice element, almost kind of like a truth and reconciliation process to drug policy reform. And yeah, there's a lot of examples in the state and federal level. Not a lot of these have passed, but state level marijuana legalization schemes, recent ones include expungements of records, and there's supposed to be funding included for like legal clinics, so that you should be able to get assistance to get your record expunged. But that's not automatic, and there's no real comparison to, say, like a wrongful prosecution settlement. If you are exonerated for a murder, or whatever, if you've been in prison for a crime you didn't commit and you are exonerated, depending on the state, you do a settlement. A lot of times that's formulaic based on what was the event, how long you've been away, and like stuff like this. But there's no offering or really even much of a discussion of restitution like that for victims of the drug war, even though now it's widely acknowledged that the drug war has been a failure. The drug war has been a costly failure. And I think the one thing else that I want to say is that the failings of marijuana legalization, of cannabis legalization, to realize some of these social justice promises has been used recently by people who do not want cannabis laws changed as a reason why, oh, you just shouldn't do it. See, you shouldn't legalize cannabis. You should keep
Mm,
it because look, see, like it didn't elevate the people you said. People were still getting arrested. Oh, it didn't work. There are people who use that argument, but they want cannabis to stay illegal. They still want it
right.
to be a tool of oppression. So, um, you know, I remember a lot of people opposing cannabis legalization who were in the industry,
Yeah,
and
I
they
remember that.
wanted,
Yeah,
I think, to be big canna. They didn't
right.
want competition from Coca-Cola, from the alcohol companies. Who, by the way, you are seeing, you have absolutely seen big tobacco and big alcohol come in and try and get a piece of the cannabis industry. You wanted people here. There were a lot of people here in California who were in the industry, who voted against it, who agitated against it. They saying because they didn't want it being taken over by capital, basically by big alcohol or
Right.
big tobacco. But those people were able to reap bigger profits on selling cannabis, unfortunately, on the backs of people going to jail for it. And I think that New York, for example, followed California um, a, a couple years after California legalized cannabis. But before the law ever changed in New York, you had two DAs in New York City say, "You want to know what? We're not going to prosecute anyone for a nonviolent cannabis crime." There's a DA in Brooklyn and the DA in Manhattan, and together, I mean, they represent about 4 million people. That's bigger than a lot of than like some states. So I think that there has been profoundly good things that have come about as a result of cannabis legalization. And I guess that's the other thing that I want to keep in mind amid the critique of the social equity program, amid the critique of the cannabis industry. These are all valid critiques. I don't think that changing cannabis laws has itself been a mistake or has made our society worse. And you will hear from people, though, who critique the cannabis industry and cannabis legalization who want to keep the status quo. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
With the DAs in New York, I mean, that sounds like more of like a decriminalization
Yeah,
sort of route that they
exactly.
took, which we've seen like I think Oregon is trying to put that into play. Portugal, I know, is
Yeah,
another place that like the country is trying to decriminalize drugs, leading to a lot more, a lot less quote unquote crime and
yeah,
potentially generational harm. Um,
yeah,
so yeah, decriminalization always something to look at. Two last questions. Any word
sure.
on what Breed is up to? London
Yeah,
Breed.
it's interesting. It's funny. From what I know, the former mayor is keeping a pretty low profile. I did try and get in touch with her for this story. I wasn't successful. And yeah, I mean, there's been speculation that she was going to get some job, maybe with one of the foundations run by former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg. But yeah, she has kept a very low profile since leaving office. And yeah, I mean, people better connected than me, but might have a better idea. I know that from what I've heard, she's been doing some travel, some reflecting type of thing. But yeah, she has absolutely kept a pretty low profile since losing her reelection bid about a year ago now.
Got it. And my last question is, where do you procure weed in the city?
Oh man, really? Okay. I mean, I'm getting older. I smoke a lot less weed
I'm curious. Yeah.
than I used to. Yeah, I think that like no, you know what? I'm gonna go out and admit it. I mean, like I don't usually shop at legal stores. I don't shop at legal stores because unfortunately, you don't have a good. There are a lot of restrictions on legal stores that are bad for the buyer, that don't make a lot of sense, and for that reason, you're generally able to get something that's fresher, something that's closer to what you might like through your personal networks.
Yeah. Excellent answer. Thank you for that.
I'll plug my
And
plug
thank
next
you.
time. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, thanks again, Chris, and we'll talk to you soon, hopefully. All right. A short addendum to Chris's story. Some of the villains are still at large, like Conor Johnston, one of the white guys who gamed SF's equity program and became one of its biggest winners here. In addition to Conor being on the team to snag 2 of 2 permits available in the city in the hate district, what are the chances that a political insider who was London Breed's old roommates and campaign manager would manage to do that without any help? Conor is still in the weed game in other states, including Illinois, where he's currently operating 2 stores and has managed to game the social equity weed programs in Illinois as well, because the system says you can't discriminate against wealthy white people who want to own social equity weed stores. Thank you for listening to the show, and especially thank you to everyone who is contributing over at patreon.com/Sad Francisco. You're making it possible for Sad Francisco to exist. And if you're not already a member, think about joining. Again, it's patreon.com/Sad Francisco.